So what exactly is the diplomatic momentum right now building in Northeast Asia and in the Asia-Pacific region as well? Let's go to our panelists. A very strong panel we have today. In Medford is Sun-Young Lee, who is a Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School at Tufts University. In Washington, D.C., we have Mr. Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. He's now visiting the United States. And in Washington, D.C., we also invited Douglas Paul, the Vice President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Gentlemen, I want to welcome the three of you to our program, but I want to begin with you, Professor Lee. We have heard through the media that the North Korean media talking about Pyongyang has not necessarily confirmed a possible meeting between the two leaders, namely the North Korean president and the American president for now. How should we understand mixed messages?
Kim Jong-un is playing hard to get. He has already tested the waters. He has reached out to South Korea, and South Korea has embraced North Korea's outreach. He has now reached out to President Trump, and President Trump almost impulsively agreed to the proposition for a date for a summit meeting. So how to assess all this? Did Kim Jong-un all of a sudden wake up on New Year's Day and have a moment of epiphany and decided that going forward he's going to be a nice guy? Highly unlikely. This is premeditated. Kim is taking a page out of his daddy's playbook in 2000 when Kim Jong-il met with a South Korean leader in June and then sent an envoy to President Clinton and invited Clinton to Pyongyang. And Clinton was very keen on making that trip. However, he was spared the embarrassment when the U.S. presidential election in November turned out into a fiasco with the vote recount, the contest between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and simply time ran out. But Clinton did send his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who within 3 weeks of the North Korean special envoy's visit to Washington was in Pyongyang toasting Kim Jong-il.
Mr. Paul, is that a historical parallel we can draw, as Professor Lee just indicated? How do you understand mixed messages coming from, quote, the North Korean press and the messages coming from the South Korean envoy who said, got the quote coming from the North Korean president directly?
Well, we have a couple of examples. One was the secretive negotiations that preceded the agreement between the Obama administration and the authorities in Iran, and an earlier one, which was the Henry Kissinger secret trip to China. In the case of China, we had the ping-pong team exchanges and some prominent visits to China that signaled an interest by the regime. We haven't had that from North Korea this time, and you didn't have that from Tehran back at the beginning of the talks over Iran. So there are complementarities and differences here. It's not reassuring that there's been no signal, for example, an invitation to someone who's friendly to both to provide a venue for Kim Jong-un to say positive things about the future for U.S.-Korean relations. On the other hand, we do have a lot of confidence in Mr. Chung Hoi-young and in Mr. Soo-hun at the Korean Intelligence Service. They've got long track records with us. We don't distrust them. We think they're competent people, and but we're relying heavily on their intermediation.
I see. It seems that, Mr. Yang, that the White House right now has already outsourced, in a way, its diplomacy on the Korean issue. At least we got already the sacking of the Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, the coming in Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, even though has been described as a person who will make the State Department great again in Washington, but we still don't know. So, Mr. Yang, here's the thing. What will Washington, from your perspective, rely on when it comes to off-the-record, off-the-table discussion with Pyongyang? It seems that what we're having right now is actions related to it.
Well, just now you used the word rely. In my observation, there's nothing reliable for the upcoming summit between U.S. and the DPRK for Americans' side. Simply because, number one, the initiative from Kim Jong-un is well and thoughtfully planned. However, there hasn't been a plan corresponding plan from U.S. side. Especially, there haven't been a matured team to take part in the upcoming summit. So even the member of the team remains on huge uncertainties, let alone to the concrete policy and plan vis-a-vis the plan, a well-planned initiative from Pyongyang.
But the thing is, we never know, right? I mean, you got no ambassador in South Korea from the United States. You do not have a special envoy on the Korean issue. But it seems that the President Trump is trying to get someone who he trusts, at least for now, into the team of the State Department. Will, as a result, the change of policy happen in Washington, D.C., and direction of negotiation happen in Washington, D.C. regarding the DPRK? Mr. Paul, your thoughts?
Well, the personnel situation is extremely complicated. We've had a departure of a lot of experienced hands. We still have a few experienced hands, but they don't have intimate relations with the White House yet. They probably will get to know each other very well in the next few weeks. Mr. Pompeo will not become Secretary of State until he's confirmed, and that won't be until April, which will be almost on the eve of the purported meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Now, whether he'll be given latitude to move in to the Secretary of State's office while awaiting confirmation remains to be seen. It's not the usual practice in the U.S. to do that. And so there's a lot of personnel issues, and there's some important policy issues that intersect with this calendar as well.
So, Professor Lee, if Washington is not reliable at all at this point to come up with, not to mention strategy, but maybe just some tit-for-tat roadmap, Professor Lee, can Washington rely on South Korea at this point? Even with the differences reporting in the North Korean press and the differences that is being said by the South Korean envoy to Washington, D.C. about the summit happens, can Washington rely on Seoul for this?
I think the situation in Washington is a factor, a concern, but I think it's less a relevant factor than Kim Jong-un calling the shots. Over the past 25 years, North Korea has really called the tunes, and the tune can go from very placid, placido to molto agitato, and then come down the ladder of escalation as well.
So
Kim Jong-un, you'll notice, has really not made any concession. He
yes.
reportedly said that he is now amenable to denuclearization talks, and he has agreed, or he has offered, not to test any missiles or nukes in the meantime. And those activities, of course, we know are prohibited by more than 10 UN Security Council resolutions. So while this is a positive development, it is no concession.
All right.
And Kim Jong-un's mere mention of abstinence from forbidden, prohibited activities is no concession at all.
Professor Lee, if you said that, then let's continue on that road. What can each side offers to the other? Let's just say South Korean, North Korean, and the United States, particularly the latter two. Professor Lee, what do you think? From North Korea, what can that side offer? From the United States, what do you think can that side offer? And how would they go in a step-by-step way so that each other could ensure that the other side would implement what they have promised?
Well, North Korea has always dangled before the U.S. the possibility of missile and nuclear test moratorium. Goes back to the Clinton years in 2000. And Kim Jong-un today, in a sort of a lazy, uncreative way, is simply recycling what he did a few years ago in 2012 against the Obama administration, when the two sides reached an agreement on Leap Day, February 29th. 2012, and just 16 days later, North Korea violated that agreement by announcing that it would launch a satellite into space, which of course requires ballistic missile technology. So I don't deny that this is a positive development, but I think the U.S. is willing to go along with this quasi or non-concession, and I think the U.S. can now make some basic demands, release detained U.S. citizens and South Korean citizens, allow the people in South Korea and North Korea, separated families, to exchange letters or make telephone calls. North Korea will not oblige, but I think small concessions we'll see coming from North Korea, and then we'll all grow very excited that North Korea has now shown a change of heart.
Okay, Mr. Paul, several things. One is military exercise. Can that be stopped or paused for a long time coming from the U.S. side? Secondly, to what extent will the denuclearized process could happen, and how would the United States check on that? I guess all of those could be issues coming from Washington toward Pyongyang if a summit could ever happen.
Well, Professor Lee has summarized well the situation. The proposals from Kim Jong-un to not test and to allow exercises to go forward is simply a recognition of reality and not a concession to the other sides in these disputes. Now, taking a different look at this, the possibility of a meeting and the willingness of the President of the United States to put his reputation on the line helps us to get out of the dilemma, which is the one we have been in, which is either more and more pressure, which could lead to conflict, and we've had a lot of talk of preventive strikes or attacks on North Korea, and the alternative is to accept their moving forward. This takes us into a realm where we might be able to find more realistic ground to try to dismantle, or failing dismantlement, cap and retard North Korea's missile and nuclear weapons programs. But we haven't seen movement toward establishing the choices that the North faces, and then the penalties and rewards that will be in the calculation of the North as to whether to accept those offers.
What about,
We're
Mr.
still
Paul?
Away from that.
What about, Mr. Paul, the choices that Washington could also make to demonstrate to Pyongyang that Washington is sincere? Is there a plan? Is there a previous plan that Washington today could take a look at reference?
I think there are a number of ideas floating around, but I doubt very much we have anything that amounts to an approved plan. Stopping their nuclear program is worth a lot. Preventing proliferation is worth a lot. That may translate into consideration of relaxation of sanctions if we have verifiable halts and verifiable examination of the capabilities of North Korea.
Okay.
The last round of talks, which was very prolonged and detailed, failed on verification, and it's very likely that verification will be the toughest part of any upcoming negotiations should they begin after the summit.
Okay, Mr. Yang, we don't want to forget that in May, the possibility summit could happen. But before that, there's going to be another one, the one between North Korea and South Korea. It seems that has been somewhat more confirmed than the one between Washington and Pyongyang. So, Mr. Yang, how much will the latter summit, if it ever happens, depends on the result of the former?
Well, I think the upcoming two summits will create a more complicated situation than before. On one hand, the two summits will certainly contribute greatly to the stabilities and reduction of tensions. However, after the two summits, where to go, how to go, will be a more difficult, complicated question to all of the three as well as to every party else. Just now you mentioned a very sharp question, say, among the three parties, what offers the three can provide respectively. But for North Korea, what they can offer has been very clear in my view. They can offer nuclear freeze. They can offer partial even verifications without reliable verification. In short, they can offer, what they can offer is something like cutting off the grass. But what cannot offer at all is something like pulling the root out of the earth. If you want them to pull out the root, no way. If you want them to cut off the grass, it's okay. But you need to pay a high price. But for South Korea, I think partially South Korea has been ready to provide to pay some price. But for Washington, D.C., I really doubt any price Donald Trump's administration can be ready, can pay or be ready to pay. That's the very sophisticated situation facing ahead.
If that is the case, Professor Lee, certainly a difference of opinion and of direction would happen between Seoul and Washington as a result.
In the past, whenever a particular nation, be it South Korea or Japan or the US or China, raised ahead of others in engaging North Korea, the other powers have followed suit. When South Korea held its first summit with the North in 2000, 2 years later, the Japanese Prime Minister visited Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-il, much to the dismay of the George W. Bush administration. However, just a few years later, Bush sought engagement with North Korea, much to the dismay of Japan in 2007 when the abductee issue, Japanese abduction issue, was sidelined by the Bush administration. Mr. Abe has first-hand experience of this changing vicissitudes of political fortune when it comes to engaging North Korea. So I would not rule out that Mr. Abe, now a bit concerned that Japan may be left out, may start his own initiative in trying to seek a summit meeting with Kim Jong-un.
But what about South Korea and the United States? You haven't answered my question, Professor Lee.
Well, South Korea and the United States are rather pleased with this outreach by Kim, and of course the South Korean, North Korean summit will precede the scheduled or the proposed meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, and that will probably be a harbinger of the right tone, the kind of bonhomie and banquets and style of the summit itself to come between Trump and Kim. But as we know, a summit meeting, unlike a blind date, you have to have all the disagreements ironed out. Spontaneity, excitement, unpredictable behavior, all these things are anathema to a summit meeting, and I think the U.S. is rushing into it, showing a bit of imprudence.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Paul?
Well, I love the blind date metaphor. I think that's a valuable one.
We've got a lot of metaphors today flying around.
Remind everybody there are a lot of cooks in this kitchen. And the one cook we have not mentioned, besides Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and the U.S., is Iran. We're coming up on the decertification of Iran in the same time period as we prepare for the proposed summit. And the administration and its new Secretary of State designate have indicated they want to end that agreement. Those things will be compared very carefully in Tehran and Pyongyang and will add tremendously to the complexity of these issues going forward.
Gentlemen, you are making the issue ever more complicated. Of course, it is an ever more complicated issue as we speak. But Mr. Yang, here's the thing. If the parties are really determined to make it happen, they could make it happen. And they will put things on the table and say to the others, and these are the things we can do, and these are the things you have to do. But now we do not see that, at least not in public eye. So, Mr. Yang, are we optimistic at all about the near prospect, at least, as we are leading our way to May?
Well, in terms of the stability, I'm optimistic. But in terms of the real cause of the denuclearization, I'm not.
All right, as simple as that, Mr. Yang, it seems. But what is going to be China's role? China has been thanked by the South Korean special envoy, saying China has been playing an active and also important role. But what will China do, and what can China do? China said, according to the Chinese foreign minister and vice foreign minister, that China is going to put them together, talk and talk and talk. But if they don't talk, what can China do?
Well, that's a very key question facing China. I think basically two things the Chinese government will try to play the best. On one hand, after the two summits, China will try every effort to maintain the momentum of the positive trend and maintain the stabilities. And on the other hand, secondly, China will try to persuade and mediate all the related parties to put the complex North Korean nuclear issue and the Korean Peninsula issue onto the two-track negotiations. One track is the negotiation on the denuclearization, the other is the building up the permanent peace regime on the peninsula.
You know, gentlemen, I remember everything you said today. So maybe in a few weeks from now, we're going to check with you guys again to see how things have evolved since today. But thank you so much for now. The three of you, Sun Young Lee, Yang Xu, Douglas Paul, thank you so much for being with us.